Hello again. My name is Sam Robinson. This is the Gnostic Syncretist Podcast. Thank you for joining me and welcome. Glad anyone that is watching is here, and everybody is welcome here on this podcast, no matter what your background or belief system. And today I want to continue where we left off when we were trying to explain the theosophical cosmology, monotheistic pantheism, and the concepts of vehicles of expression and the spiritualization and spiritual evolution of humanity itself and the current state of humanity that we are in, which is deep, consciously, mentally, societally, politically, physically, in absolutely dense materialistic thinking and modes of existing. And it's going on quite a while, at least for several hundred years, a couple hundred years now. And, most people don't even really think of it that way. Most people live their lives. They do what they do. They go to work. They go home. They watch their favorite show. They eat dinner. They have families. They go to bed. And then at the end of the week, potentially, if you're a Christian, you go to church, hear some sermons, and then you go back home. And, I would gather a large body of people from having been a Christian, have been in church for years in my youth. They're not talking about the problem of materialism at all. They largely still exist in a materialistic mindset, even while they're in church, talking about, so to speak, spiritual things and about religious things. And this is because religion can become crystallized and materialistic itself if what it teaches and what its message relays to the human individual and to its congregation isn't, so to speak, rarefied and spiritual enough to uplift them from their concretized, solidified, materialistic state of mind and thought process and being and, ideological systems that so suffocate and engulf humanity in the Western world that we just doesn't even come out, doesn't even come across as even really much of a problem. Even when you are somewhat spiritual or you are religious, most people don't even realize that largely mainstream world religions in the Western world and really throughout a lot of the world have become materialistic. They focus on the material side of things. They really do, and they don't offer the message that we need today for re-spiritualization and regeneration of the divine within inside of us, and focus far too much on things in the material world and simply stating that you just need to be a good person or do good works or have the right belief system and you're set after death in the spiritual world. Well, that's not how the universe works. The universe is a fusion of spirit and matter together as one, and they are two sides of the same coin. And the spiritual planes exist simultaneously with the material plane. And thus they need to be studied and understood because those planes are the planes of causality, and this is the plane of effects. And the causes originate in those planes, then manifest down here in the physical plane and cause problems because this is not understood. That the mental planes and the emotional planes and the plane where ideas are created, which is the mental plane, manifests down here in the physical plane. So our thoughts create the physical. Mind is first, matter is second. Mind creates the matter because you had to think it first before it came into being. And if our thought processes and our ideologies and our morality is absolutely inverted and corrupted, well, it manifests down here in the physical plane as corrupted societies, as materialistic societies, as selfish and atomized and distorted and warped versions of what it could be in an ideal state. And this message I feel is not really being propagated and promulgated enough in our day and age. And it's absolutely fundamental to our development as beings to reconnect with the divine and fuse our daily physical life with a spiritual life and a spiritual level of knowledge of how these things interact in a sort of spiritual karmic reciprocity, because we're so out of equilibrium. We're in total disequilibrium right now, and especially in the Western world in America, that all sorts of things are occurring that are just absolutely horrible. Everyone's divided more than ever. Everyone's atomized more than ever. Everyone's checked out more than ever. Everyone's less spiritual. People are absolutely selfish and materialistic and obsessed with consumerism and the next thing, and are just have totally lost sight of where we need to be going. The progressives don't know what to do, and the right doesn't know what to do. The right wing is totally trapped in their religious conservatism, which isn't helping, and the left wing is progressing, and the progressives are progressing into a scientific dictatorship of materialism, and neither side is working with the other, and both sides are living in fallacy and living in error, and there needs to be a unifying factor and a unifying principle. And this brings me to part of what this episode is about, is what the mission of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society was all about back in the 1800s, because it still resonates today even more so. If only they could see how bad it's gotten, they would be aghast. And in the 1800s, right after Darwin, and around the 1830s to the 1870s, there was this absolute crystallization of the Western mind into scientific materialism and an obsession with matter, total obsession and identification with it. And honestly, it's obviously a result and a reaction to the smothering dogmatism of the papacy and Christianity that had not allowed anything scientific to even come about, and you were burned at the stake at certain times, and it was was pushed back and suppressed and fought repeatedly, and then there was this struggle between so to speak theology and science, and then as opposed to doing the correct thing, science won and then became a dictator itself in that time period, where they took the spiritual out of everything, they took the divine out of everything, they took the superphysical and the invisible out of all investigation and all scientific examination. And at that time, you had what's called spiritualism start to rise up in the 1840s onwards. And according to Rudolf Steiner and Blavatsky and some other people around those time periods in the Theosophical Society, and this kind of revival of the occult sacred mystery school tradition ideas at that time, was you had these occult schools who, I don't know their names, nobody ever tells you their names, but they existed in America and elsewhere in the West, and they were secret, so to speak, kind of like secret society occult organizations and schools that were not necessarily dark and not necessarily good. Some of them were white occultists, some were probably dark occultists. Doesn't matter. Point being, there were some in these schools that were in prominent positions and were concerned that the Western mind and the Western being was becoming too ensconced in materialistic concepts and too ensconced in materialistic scientism and ideology, and that this was going to smother the divine spark, and smother the spirituality out of mankind in the West, and crystallize it into a state that would be unable to be reached at a later point, if not somehow altered at that point in time. So they started spiritualism, and they started spiritualism hoping, after 1840, when they started it, somehow, I don't know exactly how they started it, but they somehow started this spiritualist movement to begin and initiated it and sent it out into the Western, and specifically America, Western society, hoping and praying, I guess, probably not praying, that this would in some way revitalize and regenerate the crystallizing suffocation of materialism that was just, all over the Western world at this time. And so they pushed it out there and it had its day. And unfortunately, after several decades, they realized it was not working. The people actually just became obsessed with trying to talk to their dead loved ones, to conjure spirits at seances through mediums, and try to talk to the dead. And they became absolutely convinced that the people that were called spiritualists and their movement, that the only thing that existed was matter and then spirits of the dead, and that the phenomenon that occurred at these seances was entirely the result of dead human spirits, which was incorrect. And they realized that they had failed. And this is the point where Helena Blavatsky, a Russian mystic, medium, occultist, philosopher, comes in out of nowhere in the 1870s and ignites the theosophical spark in the Western world by creating the Theosophical Society in 1876 with William Q. Judge and Henry Scott Alcott, and in New York, and they made it in New York City, and this was a result of the failure of spiritualism to provide the necessary impetus for a re-spiritualization out of this crystallizing materialistic state of mind that it had been thrust into by science, by these occult schools. These occult schools were trying their best to keep us from descending too deeply into materialism to the point where our spirit would be suffocated. I mean, not literally, but it would become so inert as to be very, very unreachable later on. And so they first sent spiritualism, and then they sent, to a degree, some secret schools took on Blavatsky, trained her, and sent her out to relay a much more philosophical and metaphysical version of reality through the sacred mystery school traditions and occultism than what the spiritualists were now basically offering, which was not what they had intended and had failed as one attempt to keep us from total materialism. And so Blavatsky comes in and writes Isis Unveiled and the Secret Doctrine and founds the Theosophical Society and starts, somewhat defending spiritualists, but also attacking them and explaining to them in her works and her writings. She wrote many articles too about the real scientific effects, related to things that are psychic, that were actually occurring at seances, and how they weren't just spirits, that there's this whole, hierarchy of different non-physical beings, elementals, elementaries, spirits, disembodied astral shells, you know, um, and that the real spirit of a human being actually does not come back down at all, and that when we die, we leave our astral body here, and our divine spirit, our spark, goes into a higher plane than the earthly plane. But the astral shell remains on the earthly plane, potentially for a long time, and is disembodied, and it can basically somehow it's utilized to cause these mediumistic phenomenon, whether it's through the astral body of a disembodied person, and it's basically an astral shell, and they're not in it, but it is around, and mediums can accidentally bring them in, and they can cause all sorts of phenomenon that was occurring and was being studied in. It was a big craze. At the same time, it could be the astral body of the medium itself. So Blavatsky was explaining these fine distinctions between the occult phenomenon that was transpiring, and trying to not only attack science and say they can't be the only ones just sit on their podium of power and say that all that stuff's nonsense and superstition, and it doesn't exist, but yet they won't investigate it. At the same time, the spiritualists were saying it was only one sole thing as well, and so neither side was helping. And so Blavatsky comes in and gives this massive amount of information out in her two books, Isis Unveiled and the secret doctrine that had always been kept within the mystery schools for thousands of years, and with, so to speak, withheld from the public, but because they didn't think anyone was ready for that level of information, for that cosmology. And they still withheld a lot. Considering what they did release, it's pretty staggering. There's more out there. But according to Blavatsky, there was plenty withheld. But that this was necessary to release that information, the Theosophical cosmology, and everything that goes with that, and the Theosophical doctrines of reincarnation, and the subtle bodies, and the seven hermetic principles, and the root races, and everything else that's in Theosophy that we'll go over in another video. It was a necessity to try and stop this utter descent into total scientific materialism that was prevalent in this age. And she died in 1891, and the Theosophical Society was to a degree successful. It was there was one founded in America, and there was one in India, and they spread. But the problem is the metaphysics involved with these concepts is so unbelievably, astoundingly complex that a lot of people still didn't get it, even within the society itself. And others who had joined largely just to investigate the occult phenomena lost themselves in that afterwards. And it didn't. She gave it out to the world with her heart open and her head held high all the way to the end. She did her duty, and you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Did the Western world drink since she has passed? No, they did not. They have not imbibed. They have not drunk deeply from the Pierian spring of occult knowledge that was necessary to stop the descent. Rudolf Steiner tried as well. And here we are 130 years later, and it's worse than ever, ladies and gentlemen. It's terrible. We are far worse off, I would say, than we were then in her time period. And the way they spoke about it then makes it sound like it's today. We're so materialistic now. Yet they thought that was materialistic. If only they could see the digitalization and atomization that exists now, they may have thought there was no hope, honestly. But I think there is. And I don't think this is that the Theosophical Society failed at all. I think there were other forces involved. I think there were other dark occultist groups and dark occult schools that were involved that sought about to make sure that she failed after her death. And, what's interesting is the year that she died, within just a couple of years, the secret society of Cecil Rhodes and the British elite, power elite, was created to create a new world order. We're still dealing with them today. And the Rothschilds were involved in that. And we know the Rothschilds were involved with the Illuminati and largely, I can't prove it, but you can look at some pictures from some of their parties. It looks like they're into dark occultism to me in some of those parties, where I think Evelyn de Rothschild's wife is wearing an outfit with Baphomet on it and a Baphomet mask, which is the upside down goat with an upside down pentagram on it at their parties. Now you can chalk that up to just a bunch of weird, rich nonsense and flamboyance, but I beg to differ on that. There are dark occult groups and there are light occult groups. Blavatsky was a light occultist. She was trying to enlighten the world with her ideas and combat crystallization from materialism, this materialistic ideology running rampant. And there was another group, there's an other side to that group of dark occultists. We don't know the names, doesn't really matter, who thought that even if this information does get out to a degree to the public, they can utilize this. They can utilize this to create forms of control, because the things they teach you for spiritual development of the individual being in occultism, in esoteric mystery school traditions, can be used either way. It can be used for good. It can be used for bad. It can be used to strengthen and develop the individual along a spiritual line of thought. It can also be used to break down, destroy, manipulate, hypnotize, and control individuals with those techniques. and dark occult and use dark occult inversions of those techniques. You can do both, unfortunately. And what has occurred, as far as I've been able to assess with my almost a decade now of research, is that the dark occult schools, one, the Cecil Rhodes Society and the rest of them, have been using these techniques from the occult tradition because it's a form of ancient psychological development and recalibration of the mind and the different subtle principles of the body is what they teach. And it's very hard work. But you can also use them in an inverted fashion to break people down and manipulate them, social engineer them. You could probably even do astral engineering. You can manipulate their ether body or their astral body through manipulating their mind and their concepts that then exist on the mental plane and can be brought down through the chain of manifestation and become physical actions and changes in society through manipulating the thoughts of that plane and the aggregate in the mass. So they've been utilizing these techniques against us, unfortunately. And, for all people want to say about Nazism and Blavatsky and how she, somehow inspired Nazism, they read her works and they absolutely misunderstood and abused and distorted her concepts on root races and spiritual evolution of humanity. They absolutely took her symbol, the swastika, and inverted it and bastardized it and made it a symbol of the dark occult when it was a light symbol, a white occult symbol, and it goes back thousands of years. And people that accuse Blavatsky of being involved with the New World Order or the Power Elite, or accuse her of being a dark occultist, or accuse her of trying to destroy Christianity, she wasn't trying to do any of those things. She was trying to show Christianity the esoteric side of their system. She was trying to show the divine human potential that exists in all of us. She was trying to show that there is a path for spiritual development and evolution that is proper and is on a track of development that is a giant scheme for every being that goes through the universe. We are future angels and animals are future humans, so to speak, and maybe millions or billions of years off. The point being, there is a scheme and there is a way forward, and the way forward is spiritualization, not materialization. We've done that phase. We've materialized. We've gone through the materialistic scientific phase. It's time to go beyond that and unite that wonderful science with the spiritual science and occult science and unite the two together to understand the entire picture of the universe and everything in it. Because that's their one missing key. And, in quantum physics, they understand some more of this that she was talking about back then in her books that relate a lot to what they're now discovering in quantum mechanics and quantum physics, where things can be a particle and a wave simultaneously. It's because one exists in a state of potentiality and then becomes manifested as that particle. But before it's a wave, before it's latent potentiality. And they also found that the observer affects this, the mind of the observer. Well, how is that possible? Well, it's possible through the astral light and the ethereal medium that is in the background of everything and exists, so to speak, percolating and permeating everything on the physical plane. And like I said, it's the plane of causes. This is the plane of effects. Well, the mental plane is even higher than that plane. So if the mind can basically, it impacts the experimental project from the observer effect on that plane, and then it affects the plane below it, and then it affects us down here and alters the experiments evidence at the end. Yet they found that two scientists had two different answers or computations that were both correct, yet they had different ones, and it came from this effect. This basically the consciousness of the actual scientist altered the experiment and affected it, and thus they had two different answers, arrived at two different points But at the same time, they realized that both were also correct at the same time. Well, how is that possible? Well, that things are lying in a potential state, in a latent state, with a large potential to it to become many different things on down the chain of manifestation. Well, if your mind impacts that, which is what occultism says, then you could alter that on the way down, and then both are right. Both become correct answers. But your consciousness altered that answer, yet it's still correct. That's because there's invisible laws in effect on these higher planes that affect the material plane and at what we experience down here. And this is all well explained in the occult tradition. And it's fundamental to understand this, that there are these higher planes that are the planes of causes. Now each plane is a causal plane to the one below it, but is a plane of effects to the one, so to speak, above it. And when I say above it, I simply mean it's more rarefied, it's less dense, it's more spiritualized substances and entities than the one below it. The one below would be more physical, so to speak, more materialized, more dense, less rarefied, but technically more complex, more differentiated. Yet they all exist simultaneously at the same time, all interpenetrating each other. And the only reason we can't see it is because our eyes are so limited and we only see in a fraction, what is it, 0.5% or 5% of the light spectrum that exists around us, which means we basically are blind and see absolutely nothing. So anyone that says they only believe in things that they can see is a fool, because science has already stated how much you can see, which is practically nothing in terms of the light spectrum. And if that's just the light spectrum, you can only imagine what else we don't see. Since we can barely even see that. So the five senses are absolutely limiting, but are also necessary to existing in the material world, in the physical 3D physical environment that we reside in here on Earth. At the same time, there are higher potentials within the mind and consciousness of man than he's been led to believe. Blavatsky explained all of this, and that was the reason that she was an emissary on a mission to bring this information and this knowledge from Theosophy to humanity, specifically Western humanity at that time. And she is still acknowledged today. I mean, a lot. I mean, I went to see the United Lodge of Theosophists in Philly this year and last year, and before I went this year, back in probably February, my sister told me and sent me a picture of her local library. This is just like a little library, like a local Philadelphia library. Nothing to do with anything esoteric or anything like that. That had a display up of Blavatsky's works, because it was like the, not centennial. It was like maybe 100 years or something like that of maybe Theosophy being in Philadelphia, or something similar to that. But and thus they had put up behind glass pictures of Blavatsky, a small explanation of her and her biggest works behind there, and basically was presented, so to speak, for that week to the public. And she said that to me. And so even today, she's still alive, and her ideas are still alive, and her philosophy and her spirituality and her theosophy is still with us today, if only we can grasp it and take it and utilize it the way it was supposed to be utilized. And get our egos out of the way, get our materialism out of the way, get our societal corruption from the Western mindset out of the way, and realize the greater potential that exists within all of us, that she was trying to relay and explain to the West. And, seems like it's largely been fallen on deaf ears, even now, 130 years later. I mean, some people were changed, and some people benefited, clearly, a lot, and many more could. It's not that she failed, it's that we failed her. And it's not just about her. It's not the only tradition. There's Rosicrucians and anthroposophy, and, you know, but they're all united in that singular cause of uplifting humanity to an enlightened state into their divine potential and guiding them and giving them a level of esoteric knowledge that will allow them to do that when they're ready. It never comes to you unless you're ready, for the most part. And, you know, well, how do they say it in the Kabbalion? It's like, when the ears are ready, the master will come. Otherwise, it, basically falls on deaf ears. When the, what is it? How does it go? Well, I can't remember the exact phrase. Which is like when the ears will open when, they're ready for understanding. And humanity is no longer just, I don't even know if they're ready, but it's become a necessity in the age of AI, digital surveillance, smart grid systems, universal smartphones, atomization, and, so to speak, corporate governance and a one world order of digital totalitarianism, peering down at us right now from the power elite and Elon Musk and all these things. And we have to do something as a collective, as humans, as divine beings, to fight back against this de-evolutionary track and agenda that is being pushed on us by these people, by these dark occultists that try to suppress the sacred mystery school traditions from ever enlightening humanity, because then we would be outside of their control at that point. And they obviously don't want that. Instead, they've taken that information and they've utilized it to socially engineer us and manipulate us and put us in states of easy mind control and spiritual control, really. So,